From the University of California's California-China Climate Institute, this is Climate Dialogues with Jerry Brown. In episode 4, Martin Rees, British astrophysicist and cosmologist, joins Institute Chair Jerry Brown to speak about some of the world's most significant global threats, including climate change, nuclear, and cybersecurity risks. Rees is the co-founder of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and author of On the Future, Prospects for Humanity, among several other books. Listen to their conversation now.
So, Martin Rees, this is an interview for our California-China Climate Institute. This is a new institute which I established at the University of California at Berkeley. And we are dedicated to research, to dialogue, to training, to joint efforts with China to deal with climate change. But of course, climate is just one of the many topics. And so this morning, for our blog, for the Institute, I very much appreciate the chance to discuss climate, nuclear, pandemic, cyber, AI, space, and any of the other potentialities for both benefit and profound disruption. And so that's the topic here at hand. And I might just start off by asking you, your most recent book now is going to come out in paperback. What do you have you learned anything from the reaction to that book that you might be able to share with us at this point?
Yes, my book, which you kindly wrote a blurb for, which came out 2 years ago, was really about what will happen later in the century, threats from misuse of technology, and also the consequence of the imprint that humanity is having on the planet, climate, and biodiversity, etc. It was published before COVID-19, which I did discuss. In principle, I discussed pandemics, but I'm glad to say that a paperback is coming out, and I've had the chance to write a new expanded preface to offer some thoughts on COVID-19 and to say how unfortunate it was that we were so unprepared for COVID-19. We should have been more prepared because although we couldn't predict when a pandemic would happen, the idea of pandemics happening once every decade or two was surely a common idea. And if we look back at that pandemic, then it's fairly clear that we could have made its impact less severe by preparation. And given that people say that its cost for the world in the next few years may be $20 trillion plus millions of deaths, it would have been worth hundreds of billions of dollars to be better prepared. And I think that's a lesson that we should prepare better and achieve greater resilience.
Well, so why can you identify the elements that prevented world leaders from engaging in the type of cooperation that could have forestalled a substantial part of the damage we're now experiencing?
Well, I think it's really that politicians focus on the immediate. They have immediate crises, and also on local, what's happening in their country or their constituency. And it's very hard. And of course, as you know far better than me, in the context of climate policy, it's hard to get politicians to commit funds now for some possible threat that may be 20 or 30 years in the future and may affect other countries. But I think COVID-19 has been a wake-up call, and they will prepare in the future. And of course, the kind of thing that's needed has to be done internationally, because the best thing to do is to ensure that we notice if some new disease appears in the animals in some farm in Vietnam or China or something like that and catch it at source. That's something which the WHO has to do. And also we need to prepare, understand vaccines, etc., so that we can cope more fully. But I think there's another thing we've learned, which is that there's a trade-off between resilience and efficiency. And it's very efficient, for instance, to have hospital beds 95% full all the time. But it's better to keep a reserve capacity for a crisis, as the Germans did, but our country did not. And it's best not to depend on just-in-time delivery and a single supply chain where breaking one link can screw up manufacturing in a serious way. So I think there is going to be a realization that we've got to be prepared to spend in what seems slightly inefficient by, for instance, keeping an inventory of stocks and having multiple supply chains in order to be resilient in the face of future pandemics, and of course, in the face of other kinds of threats. And cyber attacks are, of course, something else we need to worry about. I just received an 800-page document from an American government department on all the threats due to AI. And those are the kind of things which need to be worried about too and prepared against. So I think people are learning for all these general threats that it's important to prepare. It's worth paying an insurance premium to make us more resilient and more prepared.
Do you think this might reinvigorate some local manufacturing or local activity? For example, our supply chain now is so elongated that my own experience here out on a ranch, I'm out in the rural area of Northern California, and when I went to purchase some walking sticks to climb the mountains with, they were made in China. And
yes.
When last Christmas I wanted to put a creche of the baby Jesus and Mary and Joseph and the angels with lights, I bought it, and it was manufactured in China.
Yes.
So walking sticks and even Jesus now have to be sought in
yes.
China. And I wonder, couldn't some of our local people have that capacity? Because I'm here in an old former stagecoach stop where my great-grandfather came in the 19th century, and they made virtually everything. Now, I'm not saying we're going back to that, but do you see any reinvigoration of local community, local craft and activity?
I would hope so. Of course, there's the old debate about protectionism, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing for the economy, but I could certainly see that. And of course, the other thing that's happening is that with more robotics, then the advantage of cheaper labor is getting less. And of course, that's really how the Asian tigers of China, Taiwan, and South Korea were able to develop so fast by undercutting the labor rates in Europe and North America. But of course, with robots, that's becoming less effective. So I certainly think that on those grounds, there will be less of an imperative to import so much from China.
And of course, when it came to wind machines and photovoltaic panels, it wasn't just cheaper labor, but it was actual subsidy, cheaper capital that allowed the Chinese to bankrupt and displace German and American wind and solar manufacturers. Well, if all we're talking about is money, then England or Germany or the United States can put up money and do the same thing to reduce the cost of capital, money.
Yes. But in that context, since the Chinese are the greatest CO2 polluters in the world, then probably it's a good thing in the long run that they have had a crash program to develop cheap solar panels. So probably we shouldn't discourage that.
Well, the paradox is that just 10 years ago, when I was running for governor, I prepared an energy plan, and I couldn't imagine that photovoltaic would be as extensive, or that California right today would be over 30% on real renewable, not counting hydro or nuclear, that would be this far. And that is directly due to the Chinese driving down the price because of their industrial policy, their government intervention in the so-called free economy. So our energy success, our climate success in California is due in part to that Chinese action.
Yes, yes. But of course, thinking of the climate, then what's going to be very important, I would have thought, in the next 20 years is to ensure that countries like India and in Africa, where they need more per capita energy consumption in order to develop, to ensure that they can afford to leapfrog directly to clean energy and don't feel they have to build more coal-fired power stations. So bringing down the cost of renewables and energy storage and all that is surely going to be very good for the world if it prevents poor countries feeling they've got to build coal-fired power stations. And that's an issue for India, I think, at the moment, but that's going to be the case for Africa, which is going to need more energy per capita and have a much bigger population by 2050.
Well, okay, there you hit on the point of government decision, government spending money to bring down the cost of whether it's domestically in the United States or in India, or helping from United States to India or any other country. That raises the point about the thinking of political leaders, of President Biden, of President Xi, of President Putin, or President Merkel, or Boris Johnson. Are these people, do you think, well, I'm not going to put it as a question, I'm going to put it as a statement. When I see the ravages of the pandemic in India, I don't hear that President Biden is calling up President Xi, say, hey, what are we going to do? We can't let this happen. And not only do we have to help India, we got to help Africa with vaccines, with assistance. I don't hear that phone call. I'm not being told that is happening. And I don't understand, if the pandemic is such a wake-up call, why aren't these leaders talking more how to mobilize their money that's going to everything from baseball to ice cream, to many other things? We see a human demand here, and the same can be said of these other threats of nuclear, of climate. That's what our Climate Institute in California is, to get people to be aware and then to take action. But on just the score of what we're speaking now of the energy on the pandemic, do you perceive that world leaders, as you understand them to be, that they're worried enough that they're talking and forming some kind of collaborative effort now?
Well, a bit more, and I think it can be a win-win situation, because if they can have R&D and develop even better clean energy, which then can be used for the rest of the world as well as our own country, that is a plus. But I think, of course, I say this hesitantly because you've got far more experience of this. In the climate context, I think business leaders are talking in a seemingly more serious fashion about these concerns than they were a few years ago. And of course, politicians are influenced by them more than perhaps by academics and scientists. And so I am rather optimistic that there will be at least some fairly firm pledges made at the Glasgow conference later this year. But of course, ensuring that they are fulfilled is a different matter. But I don't know what you feel, but I feel that there is a far wider awareness of the climate crisis as being, in effect, a global emergency. And I think it's important that individual voters should care, because, of course, politicians won't take action if they don't think they'll keep their voters behind them. And that's why I think we should welcome the demonstrations and campaigns by the young, and as I like to put it, the rather sort of disparate quartet of Pope Francis, David Attenborough, Bill Gates, and Greta Thunberg. You couldn't think of four such different people as them. Those people together have really had a significant impact on world opinion and mean that politicians in democracies can take action that's good for the long-term climate without feeling that the voters don't care or without feeling they lose votes. So that's why I'm optimistic that it's not hopeless to expect that there will be pledges fulfilled to cut CO2 emissions, and also the technology of electric cars and all the rest is developing. So I think we can be more optimistic about that.
Well, I agree that the corporate leaders themselves, many of these banking and insurance executives, as well as popular opinion, Pope Francis, Greta, there's a lot of awareness. I would, though, point out, and I think that's a positive. John Kerry went to China. The first Biden administration person going to China was someone talking about climate. So that shows the power of that public awareness, that mobilization of activity and voice throughout the world. So that's a good, but I still don't see in these other issues, the pandemic, nuclear, AI, that the leaders are talking enough, transcending the nationalistic concern. So there's a great deal of feeling in America that we can't talk to China unless we denounce almost at great length the misdeeds that we perceive. Same is true with Russia and other places. Well, there's only so much bandwidth. And so we have to have so much for denunciation and so much for collaboration and joint effort. And so I think that the climate is a good example where public opinion is forcing the dialogue, but but the resistance, it's so difficult. For example, reducing coal in China is going to come at a great price. Reducing oil in America is going to come at a great political price, and it's going to take. It's almost like we're like a rocket ship trying to escape the gravity sink of the Earth. We've got to pull out of the fossil fuel gravity sink here and get into a renewable orbit. Right. And it's going to take more than I see happening to date.
Yes. No, there's a long way to go, but I just feel that public opinion is probably changing, and business opinion, and of course the campaigns by the young, who will be alive at the end of a century, are to be welcomed, it seems to me.
Now, from your sense, do you think that we have enough time, and from your understanding of research and development and technology, that given the problem of the climate, and you could throw in biodiversity and habitat destruction as well, is that reasonable, and is there enough time to think that if the leaders pull together, driven by widespread popular concern, that we have enough time and that we can actually invent the technology and the lifestyle changes to become resilient and sustainable?
I think so. Of course, we don't know quite how quickly we get to the risky tipping points and all that. But I do think that it would be important to try to accelerate the technologies, because if it was a big priority, a national emergency, and we encouraged more R&D, I suspect one could have more efficient solar, much cheaper batteries, ways of storing energy for 6 months over seasons. And also one might want to have, for instance, some smart grid, which is transcontinental or worldwide even, to allow renewable energy to be transferred from where it's generated to where it's needed. So I think that there's tremendous scope for speeding things up. by really giving it higher priority. Because the amount of money being spent on R&D in energy, it's tiny compared to defense R&D.
So your sense, based on all your long experience, is it's possible to cope with this climate threat, but
yes.
we got to take it as a national, international emergency and operate
yes.
on that basis.
It's got to be treated that way, I think, yes.
And it doesn't appear that we're treating it quite, we're not there yet, I wouldn't say.
No.
I don't even know that we're close. I mean, compared to 5 years ago, we've made significant progress, but relative to what the world has to do, it seems to me we need a paradigm shift in political.
Yes. And I think technology is going to be crucial because it's going to be very hard to get to net zero if people have to give up their gas-fired boilers and have something more expensive and less efficient instead. But if in fact we can ensure that the transition is to something which is more economical and more efficient and is preferred anyway, then people will voluntarily do it. So we've got to make sure that the technology exists so that not just our countries, but countries like India can leapfrog directly to clean energy, just as in India they've leapfrogged directly to smartphones and never had landlines. We've got to make sure that they can afford to use the latest technology. And of course, we've got to develop it jointly with them.
Now, I recall reading James Lovelock's book, Gaia's Revenge, many years ago.
Yes.
And he said, if the world doesn't produce 1,000 nuclear reactors very quickly, the last breeding pair of humans would slink with a camel or two, I think, to the Antarctic, if I remember how he ended that book.
Yes. Right. Yes.
What do you think of that?
Yes. Well, I should say, I mean, I know Jim Lovelock, he's aged 101 and still going strong. But he slightly changed his views, I think, but he still is very pro-nuclear. And I think he's right on that. And I think that as part of the mix of getting carbon-free energy, we should have nuclear. But this is again a case where I think R&D is needed because the designs that are used for most of the nuclear power stations date from the 1960s. And I'm sure one could do much better with miniaturized reactors and modular reactors and all that. So I personally think that in the mix of clean energy, we ought to include nuclear. I know some people, some Greens don't want to do that, but I think one should include it. So I'm with Lovelock to that extent.
So let me just shift to our remaining minutes here. A book has come out written by Toby Ord, The Precipice, where he talks about humanity having a 1 in 100 chance of avoiding extinction in the last century, and that's now been reduced to a 1 in 6 chance. So I want to ask you, one, what do you think of how you come up with odds like that? And then secondly, whether or not that's more of a metaphor than a mathematical estimate. What do you think of this talk of, well, what do you just think of the book, The Precipice, or the idea behind it?
Yes, well, I mean, I know Toby and his book, and I think those numbers are very speculative. We just don't know. In fact, in a book I wrote nearly 20 years ago, I said it might be almost 50-50 at the end of civilization this century. But again, we just don't know. But I think there are these new threats, though the environmental threats and climate, but also the misuse of technology, massive cyber attacks, etc., which could destroy the fabric of civilization and lead to sort of anarchy or such a setback that we never recover. So I think these are serious. The one respect in which I disagree with Toby is that he imagines that human beings potentially have a 1,000,000-year future. And he thinks that we should have a sort of conclave lasting several centuries where the human race gets together to sort of plan its long-term future. And that seems to me deeply unrealistic, because the line I would take is that technology is changing so fast that it could be that human beings themselves may not exist even 1,000 years from now. Genetic modification and cyborg techniques may have changed us completely by then. So I think we can't plan ahead that far. But I think what is right is that we do face a crucial choice this century, because we could, by mistakes of all kinds, end civilization's potentiality. On the other hand, we could avoid foreclosing the future options so that we are the beginning and not the end of intelligent life on Earth. And that's what we should aim to do. We don't know how it will develop, but I think we've got to make sure that we don't jeopardize a long-term future by a setback that actually destroys the kind of civilization we've got to now.
All right. Now, following up, Toby Ord is definitely saying extinction is not a joke. It's not a trivial possibility. It's a real possibility. Now,
well, I mean, I'd say to wipe out all human beings is pretty unlikely, but to have a setback to civilization which is so severe that we're back in the Middle Ages, as it were, that is not crazy. Because let me give one example I gave in my book, which is that whereas the Black Death killed half the population of many towns and the other half went on resignedly, now, if we had a pandemic which killed more than 1% of the population, that would lead to severe social breakdown, because that would overwhelm hospitals and people would have high expectations not fulfilled. And of course, Europe and the US have had 0.3% fatalities from COVID-19. And so a more severe pandemic could cause a breakdown. And suppose that the internet had failed in the middle of the pandemic. That would have certainly led to a breakdown of social order. So we are very vulnerable now. And so I think the possibility of a setback globally to civilization is something which we shouldn't rule out, even though extinction of all humans is less likely. And we're so interconnected. We can't have a crisis in one continent without others. There's a famous book by Jared Darman called Collapse, where he talks about several different collapses that have happened in different continents. Now, anything that's really bad will cascade globally.
So it's fair to say that whether it's climate or AI or nuclear or pandemic or all of them interacting, there's profound risk of horror. We could just put it that way. There is serious risk of horror that can show up in a variety of ways that we touched on. Now, you said 20 years ago, you felt it was 50-50. Now, you've had 20 more years to live, to think, to read, and to reflect. Is it better or worse in your mind today?
Well, I think it's probably worse because we've got more explicit scenarios which we can imagine. Obviously, the nuclear threat may come back, as in the Cold War, and be handled less well and less luckily than it was at the time of Cuba. But I think what worries me is partly the environmental and climate crises, but more what worries me are the misuse of powerful technologies. A cyber attack where just one person or a few people empowered by AI can take down the electricity grid in a whole region, and even worse perhaps, the bioengineering of more virulent and more transmissible viruses, which can be done by technology that's going to be widely available and can be done using the kind of laboratory facilities that people have access to. And so I worry very much about that. And I worry especially because even if we have regulations that certain dangerous kinds of experiments can't be done, enforcing those regulations is as hopeless as enforcing the drug laws globally or the tax laws globally. It's not like monitoring nuclear disarmament treaties because they involve large, conspicuous, special purpose facilities. We can't really monitor everyone to be sure that some weirdo or bad actor can produce a dangerous pathogen. And there's going to be, I think, a really serious tension between three things we want to preserve: privacy, liberty, and security. The Chinese, I guess, will give up liberty. We give up liberty and privacy, and they will be more secure. It's not clear what the choice will be in our countries, but I think it is going to be a tension simply because, as I put it, the global village will have its village idiots, and they will have a global range, and even one may be too many. And this is my real nightmare, because I don't quite see how we're going to avoid that sort of thing happening unless we have very intrusive surveillance of everyone all the time.
So you raised the point. Now we have the threat of collapse or great existential horror. And then along with that, we have the madman, the crazy man, crazy person that could ignite some bio threat becoming easier and easier. And you're worried about that. You don't see an analog to nuclear disarmament treaties. So I'd say a couple of things. One, it's absolutely imperative that our leaders work together, talk more, do more. And number two, they don't get slowed down by the boogeyman of alien ideology. I think it's no time for that. We have to work on these common problems. And yeah, we don't like communism. We don't like this. We don't like that. But we have even greater horrors in the offing. And then so that just demands not only political collaboration at the highest level, but also citizen activism, academic activism, cultural activism, to try to raise the level of awareness. And then a final point is that this matter of freedom, the West, as we used to call Europe and America, versus the East, China, what have you, repression versus liberty. Well, that's very much on the chopping block. That's up for grabs. How are we going to value liberty, threat reduction, and the way we want to be? So this is indeed, I think, a pretty unique time in human history when something, the very basis of our modern freedom is now going to be put up to debate when it's juxtaposed to liberty and security from all these risks we've been talking about.
Yes, yes. No, certainly we've got to try and ensure that our politicians can surmount ideological barriers and cooperate with China in particular, because China is going to be the dominant power, there's no doubt about that. And it deserves credit for bringing more people out of poverty in the last 30 years than the rest of the world put together. And so I think one has to work with it, although with a certain prudence.
Yeah, so we got to work with what we don't like. We got to be afraid of something we can't control. And we got to confront a serious debate between our way of life and something very different. Boy, that's a lot. That's a lot for people of our elder age, I would say.
Yes, but I think if we think of how fast the world's changed in the last 50 years, then the changes in the next 50 years can be even greater, and they need to be in those respects.
Well, let me tell you, just seeing the smile on your face, knowing all that you know, I feel comforted. And I very much thank you for this conversation. I thoroughly enjoy speaking with you, and there's a lot to reflect on.
Yes. Well, it's a great privilege to talk with you, and it's wonderful that you are still campaigning so hard on these global issues.
Well, we do it together.
Right.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you very much.